Let's get real for a second. You're not crazy, you're not needy, and no, you're not imagining things. That hot and cold behavior, the silence after a moment of connection, the way they shut down the second you start getting close, that's not love, that's a game. Today, we're going to talk about what's really going on when someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style pulls away just as things start to feel right. They want connection, but they fear losing control even more. And instead of building intimacy, they use control, confusion, and emotional distance to keep you exactly where they want you, close enough to feel desired, but far enough that they don't feel vulnerable. This isn't about blaming or labeling, it's about calling out the patterns that leave you feeling anxious, rejected, and stuck in giving you the clarity and courage to respond differently. Because once you see the game, you stop playing it. And that's where your power begins. Let's go. Dismissive avoidants often pride themselves on being independent, so much so that their entire identity can revolve around it. They carry themselves like they don't need anyone, like they're self-sufficient to the point of emotional invincibility. But here's what most people don't realize, that intense independence isn't strength. It's a defense mechanism. It's a carefully built wall around their deepest fear, intimacy that makes them feel exposed, seen, and potentially hurt. When someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style starts getting close to another person, especially in romantic relationships, alarm bells go off inside. Even if they're physically present, even if they say the right things, you'll start to feel them emotionally checking out. They may seem distant, disinterested, or overly focused on their own space, routines, or responsibilities. They may even tell you explicitly or implicitly that they just don't need much from a partner. That's the illusion of independence. What's happening behind the scenes is a lot more complicated. Somewhere in their early life, often in childhood, they learned that needing someone wasn't safe. Maybe they grew up in a home where emotions were dismissed, where affection was inconsistent, or where vulnerability was punished or ignored. So they adapted, they shut parts of themselves down, they became self-reliant to survive, and that survival strategy calcified into a personality trait. I don't need anyone, I'm fine on my own. The problem is, we are wired for connection. Even the most avoidant person wants love, closeness, and intimacy. But for dismissive avoidance, wanting connection triggers fear, fear of losing control, fear of being overwhelmed, and most deeply, fear of being abandoned or disappointed. So they wear that mask of independence like armor. And it works for a while. They might come off as strong, cool, confident, and unbothered. But underneath that surface is a lot of emotional suppression. They don't stop feeling, they just don't allow themselves to express it or even fully recognize it. If you're in a relationship with someone like this, it can be maddening. You reach out, you try to connect, and they seem indifferent. You open up, they shut down. You get closer, they pull away. And every time you question it, they make it seem like you're the problem for needing too much. That's part of the power game. Their independence becomes a weapon. It's not that they're actively trying to hurt you. It's that the only way they know how to feel safe is by staying emotionally detached, by controlling how close anyone can get to them. They maintain a sense of control over their own emotional world. But here's the truth. True independence isn't about shutting people out. It's about knowing who you are, being emotionally responsible for yourself, and still being able to engage in meaningful, vulnerable relationships. What dismissive avoidants are doing isn't true independence. It's avoidance dressed up as strength. It's fear pretending to be self-confidence. If you've been caught in this dynamic, you probably felt confused, unseen, and emotionally starved, wondering why someone who says they care about you acts like they couldn't care less. That confusion is part of the emotional toll this pattern creates. Because when someone keeps you at arm's length while denying your emotional reality, it doesn't just hurt, it can start to make you question your worth. That's why it's so important to call out the illusion. To recognize that what looks like independence is actually a deeply ingrained pattern of self-protection, one that will continue to play out until it's named, understood, and challenged. So, no, you're not too much. You're not needy. You're human. And wanting connection from someone you care about is not a weakness. It's a sign of emotional health. The real question isn't why they need so much space. It's why they're afraid of closeness. Because behind that fear, behind that illusion of independence, is a human being who doesn't know how to feel safe when love gets real. And unless they're willing to look at that truth, they'll keep pushing people away in the name of control, while missing out on the very thing they secretly crave. The push-pull dynamic is one of the most exhausting and emotionally destabilizing patterns in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant. It's the cycle where one moment they're affectionate, attentive, even vulnerable, and the next they're cold, distant, or completely withdrawn. You find yourself walking on eggshells, trying to decode their behavior, wondering what you did wrong, and how something that felt so good yesterday now feels so disconnected. But this isn't random. It's a deeply rooted survival mechanism for someone who fears intimacy just as much as they crave it. At the heart of the push-pull pattern is internal conflict. Dismissive avoidants aren't emotionless. They do have feelings and they do desire connection, but connection feels dangerous. Vulnerability feels like a threat. So when they start to feel close to someone, their nervous system interprets it as a loss of control. That closeness, instead of feeling safe, triggers a fear of engulfment, of losing their autonomy, of being consumed or obligated. So they pull back. The push often happens when they're feeling secure or lonely enough to reach out. Maybe they initiate contact, open up a little, or let their guard down just enough to let you in. In these moments, you might feel hopeful. You start to think things are finally changing. You might even feel emotionally bonded. And for a brief time, the connection feels real. But that's exactly when the panic sets in for them. As the emotional stakes rise, the dismissive avoidant starts to feel exposed. The intimacy that felt good in the moment now feels like a trap. So they pull. This can look like silence, avoidance, criticism, or suddenly focusing on everything wrong in the relationship. They might cancel plans, act aloof, or insist they need space. Sometimes they pick a fight out of nowhere. Other times they simply disappear. What they're doing is hitting the emotional brakes because the closeness made them feel out of control. This unpredictability is where the emotional damage begins. As the other person in the relationship, you start to internalize the pattern. When they pull away, you chase. When they come back, you soften. And each cycle trains you to be more and more focused on keeping the connection alive, no matter how inconsistent it becomes. Over time, this creates an imbalance where you're always adapting to their comfort level, always trying to earn the closeness they keep taking away. It's confusing, painful, and often deeply damaging to your sense of self. What makes this dynamic so tricky is that it's not overt manipulation. Dismissive avoidants aren't typically trying to play games on purpose. In their mind, they're just protecting themselves. But the end result is the same. They hold the power by controlling when intimacy happens and when it gets shut down. You never feel quite safe. You never know where you stand. And you start to mistake their moments of warmth for progress, when in reality, it's just part of the loop. It's important to understand that this cycle can't be fixed by just loving harder, being more patient, or waiting for the real version of them to show up consistently. The person who comes close and then pulls away is the real version. The push-pull isn't a phase. It's their default setting when intimacy feels threatening, and unless they're actively working on their attachment patterns, the cycle will keep repeating. For someone on the receiving end, breaking free of this pattern starts with seeing it for what it is, recognizing that their inconsistency isn't a reflection of your worth, but of their fear, that the connection you feel during the push doesn't negate the emotional harm caused by the pull. And most importantly, that you deserve emotional stability, not just fleeting moments of closeness, followed by distance you're left to explain away. The push-pull dynamic is not love. It's a trauma response masquerading as romance. And until it's named, confronted, and healed, it will continue to wear down both people involved. Understanding this isn't about blame. It's about clarity. Because once you truly understand the pattern, you stop taking it personally. You stop chasing, and you start reclaiming your emotional peace. Control is the cornerstone of how dismissive avoidants manage relationships. They don't always come across as controlling in the traditional sense. There's no overt domination or micromanaging. Instead, their control shows up through emotional distance. By keeping others at arm's length, they maintain a sense of power over how close anyone can get, how much they reveal, and when or if intimacy occurs. It's subtle but deeply effective, and it's often so ingrained that they don't even realize they're doing it. For a dismissive avoidant, vulnerability feels dangerous. It's tied to early experiences where expressing emotions or depending on others may have led to disappointment, rejection, or even shame. So as adults, they regulate those emotions by suppressing them. They detach, they downplay, they shut down, and they use distance as a way to stay safe. From the outside, it might look like calm or independence, but on the inside, it's a tightly managed system designed to avoid pain. This emotional distancing isn't just about avoiding vulnerability for themselves, it's also a way to control the dynamics of the relationship. When someone keeps you guessing, when they give you very little to work with emotionally, they control the pace, the depth, and the direction of the connection. You can't move forward without their permission. You can't deepen the bond unless they allow it. And most of the time, they don't. This creates a subtle but powerful imbalance. You end up doing most of the emotional labor, initiating conversations, addressing conflicts, expressing feelings, seeking reassurance while they remain withdrawn, neutral, or vague. If you push for clarity or closeness, they may respond with detachment or irritation. If you pull back to protect yourself, they might re-engage just enough to keep you hooked, but they always make sure the emotional thermostat stays under their control. Over time, this kind of control chips away at your sense of safety. Relationships are supposed to be mutual. They're supposed to involve shared vulnerability, open communication, and emotional reciprocity. But when you're with someone who consistently uses distance to stay in control, you're always second-guessing yourself. You wonder if you're too emotional, too needy, too intense. You may even start to regulate yourself just to avoid triggering their shutdown. The thing is, this dynamic doesn't mean they don't care at all. Dismissive avoidants can feel love, but they fear what that love might require of them. They fear the surrender that closeness demands. So to avoid feeling powerless, they create space. That space becomes a wall between them and their own emotional world and between them and you. It's their way of maintaining control in an environment they've learned to see as unsafe. In many cases, they may not even realize how much their need for control is driving their behavior. They might genuinely believe they're being low drama or easygoing, but underneath that is often a deep discomfort with emotional expression and a fear of being dependent on anyone. So instead of communicating or connecting, they manage people by limiting access. They don't ask much, they don't give much, and they keep things on their terms. The danger in this pattern is that it can mimic stability. If you're someone who craves peace and avoids conflict, their cool, distant demeanor might seem grounding at first. But emotional distance is not the same as emotional maturity. Real security in a relationship comes from openness, honesty, and the ability to face emotional discomfort together, not from keeping everything surface level and avoiding depth at all costs. If you find yourself constantly feeling like you're the only one trying, like your emotions are too big for the relationship, or like you're being kept out of some locked emotional room, you're probably caught in this dynamic. And it's important to remember that you cannot love someone out of their fear of closeness. You cannot force intimacy where emotional walls have been built for decades. What you can do is recognize the control behind the emotional distance. Not to blame, but to understand. To stop internalizing their detachment as a reflection of your worth. And to choose relationships where emotional openness isn't rationed out like currency, but given freely, with trust and mutual care. Because control through distance might protect them, but it only imprisons you. One of the most frustrating and painful behaviors of someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style is their tendency to minimize emotional needs, their own and yours. To them, needing something from another person feels like weakness. Expressing a desire for closeness, comfort, or reassurance stirs up discomfort because it threatens the illusion that they're completely self-sufficient. So they shut it down. They downplay emotions, dismiss concerns, and often make their partner feel silly, dramatic, or needy for wanting normal human connection. But this isn't because they're cold-hearted. It's because they've been trained, often from an early age, to believe that needs are dangerous, shameful, or burdensome. Dismissive avoidants tend to grow up in environments where emotional expression was discouraged, invalidated, or outright ignored. Maybe they were told to stop crying, to toughen up, or that it's not a big deal. Maybe they were praised for being the easy or independent child, and they learned that being low maintenance earned approval. Over time, this wires their brain to equate emotional needs with rejection or disappointment. So, in adulthood, when those same needs naturally arise in close relationships, they don't know how to respond except to push them down or pretend they don't exist. This internal minimization of needs becomes a survival tactic. If you convince yourself that you don't need anyone, then you never have to risk being let down. If you never ask for support, then you can't be rejected. But in a relationship, this creates a huge disconnect because while they're working hard to suppress their emotional world, you're likely trying to build a connection that requires openness, vulnerability, and mutual support. And the more emotionally available you try to be, the more uncomfortable they become. When you bring up concerns or try to express how you're feeling, their instinct is often to dismiss, minimize, or shut the conversation down. They might say things like, "You're overthinking it," "You're too sensitive," or "I don't see the problem." These responses aren't just invalidating, they're a form of emotional deflection. Instead of engaging with the reality of the emotional moment, they redirect it, diminish it, or make it seem irrational. This keeps the emotional temperature low, which is where they feel safest. But to the person on the receiving end, this behavior is deeply wounding. It creates a situation where you start to question your own emotions. You wonder if you're being unreasonable for wanting closeness. You might even start silencing yourself to avoid being dismissed again. Over time, this erodes your emotional safety and self-trust. You become conditioned to suppress your own needs, just like they do, except it hurts you far more because you're not avoiding vulnerability or being denied it. Another layer of this pattern is how dismissive avoidants often idolize logic over emotion. They may pride themselves on being rational or practical and look down on what they perceive as emotionality or drama. But this isn't true balance, it's avoidance masquerading as maturity. Emotional intelligence includes the ability to acknowledge, process, and express emotions in a healthy way. Dismissive avoidants often skip that entire step. And instead of building intimacy through honest communication, they rely on emotional numbness to maintain control and distance. Even in moments where they seem to let their guard down, they quickly retreat if things get too real. If they show affection, they might follow it with a distancing behavior, like going silent or pulling back for days. If they open up, they may quickly act as though it never happened. Because in their world, emotional exposure feels like losing control. And minimizing needs, both yours and theirs, is the way they regain that control. The truth is, emotional needs aren't weaknesses. They are the very thing that make connection possible. We all need to feel seen, heard, valued, and comforted. We all need moments of reassurance, especially when we're vulnerable. Minimizing those needs doesn't make someone strong. It makes them disconnected. And while it may protect a dismissive avoidant from the risks of intimacy, it also prevents them from ever fully experiencing the richness of love. If you're in a relationship with someone who minimizes emotional needs, it's important to remember that your feelings are valid. Wanting emotional support, depth, and connection is not a flaw. And no matter how much someone tries to downplay what you feel, that doesn't make your needs any less real. You deserve a relationship where emotions are welcomed, not suppressed, where being human isn't something you have to apologize for. One of the most emotionally destabilizing behaviors someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style can engage in is withdrawing without explanation and then making you feel like you're the one who's overreacting for noticing it. This is a subtle form of gaslighting. It's not always intentional, but the effect is the same. You start to doubt your own perceptions, question your emotional responses, and suppress your very real need for connection in order to maintain the relationship. Withdrawal becomes their weapon of choice, and emotional confusion becomes your new normal. When a dismissive avoidant feels threatened by closeness, intimacy, or emotional intensity, their natural instinct is to pull back. They might stop texting, cancel plans, become vague in conversation, or simply go quiet for days. If you try to bring it up, ask if something's wrong, or express how their distance makes you feel, they often respond with denial, deflection, or subtle blame. You'll hear things like, "I've just been busy," "You're reading too much into this," or "Why are you making this a big deal?" These responses aren't just frustrating, they're deeply invalidating. And over time, they teach you not to trust your own emotional reality. This form of withdrawal creates a dynamic where they control the emotional rhythm of the relationship. They decide when there's closeness and when there's space. They set the tone for what's acceptable to feel or express. And the moment you challenge that or ask for more, they retreat physically, emotionally, or both. It leaves you feeling confused, hurt, and anxious. You replay conversations, second-guess your reactions, and try to tone yourself down in the hope of being less much. And that's the trap, because their withdrawal is not just about space, it's about resetting the balance of power. The real damage happens when this withdrawal is paired with denial. If someone pulls away and then pretends nothing happened, they leave you with a gap in reality. Something shifted, you felt it. But when you try to name it, they act like you're imagining things. That disconnect between your experience and their response creates internal conflict. It's gaslighting, not in the dramatic, malicious way we sometimes think of, but in the subtle, corrosive way that undermines your sense of emotional safety. You start to tell yourself that maybe you are too sensitive, maybe you do have unrealistic expectations, maybe wanting communication, consistency, or reassurance makes you needy or difficult, but it doesn't. Those are basic emotional needs in any healthy relationship. The real issue is that the dismissive avoidant has built their emotional framework around self-protection, not connection. And anything that challenges that structure, even if it's just you wanting to talk about your feelings, gets treated as a threat. This kind of emotional gaslighting isn't always deliberate. Often, the dismissive avoidant genuinely believes they haven't done anything wrong. In their mind, pulling away isn't abandonment, it's self-regulation. Not answering a message for 2 days isn't avoidance, it's just needing space. But because they don't acknowledge the emotional impact of their behavior, they dismiss yours. They don't validate your experience. They don't own their part in the disconnect. And they rarely offer repair. What makes this even harder is that their periods of re-engagement, when they come back around as if nothing happened, can feel like relief. You miss them. You want things to go back to normal. So when they reappear, you often don't push for accountability. You don't ask the hard questions because you're afraid they'll just pull away again. And slowly you become conditioned to accept the pattern, to keep quiet, to tolerate the emotional whiplash just to stay connected. But this is not a sustainable or healthy dynamic. Being in a relationship where withdrawal is used as a form of control, consciously or not, leaves you constantly walking on emotional eggshells. You learn to suppress your truth, to anticipate their distance, and to make yourself smaller so they'll stay. That is not love. That is emotional survival. Healing from this kind of dynamic starts with recognizing it for what it is. If someone consistently withdraws when emotions arise and then invalidates your response, that's not healthy communication. It's emotional avoidance wrapped in control. And no matter how much you love them, no matter how patient or understanding you try to be, you cannot build a secure connection with someone who refuses to meet you in emotional reality. You deserve a relationship where silence isn't punishment, where distance isn't used to dodge responsibility, and where your feelings aren't dismissed but honored. Withdrawal without accountability isn't just absence, it's a silent erasure of the connection you're trying to create. And you don't have to live in that silence. You get to choose emotional clarity. You get to choose yourself. One of the most overlooked but emotionally exhausting behaviors that dismissive avoidants often use to maintain control in relationships is emotional unavailability masquerading as independence. At first glance, it might seem admirable. Someone who's self-sufficient, low drama, doesn't need constant reassurance, and vows their alone time. In a world that often glorifies stoicism and self-reliance, this can feel like a mature, grounded presence. But dig deeper. And what you often find isn't true independence. It's emotional detachment being presented as strength. And that difference matters because while independence creates balance, emotional unavailability creates walls. True independence is about being able to take care of yourself while still being open to connection, intimacy, and emotional exchange. It's not about avoiding dependence. It's about maintaining autonomy while staying emotionally present. Dismissive avoidants, however, often confuse the two. For them, needing someone else feels threatening. Relying on someone or opening up emotionally feels like giving up control. So they build a narrative around being independent when what they're really doing is shutting down the emotional parts of themselves that feel vulnerable. In relationships, this shows up in all kinds of subtle ways. They don't talk about their feelings, not really. They avoid deep conversations, especially if those conversations involve emotional risk. They stay on the surface, keep things light, and may even joke or deflect when the topic gets too personal. If you try to go deeper, they might say they're not the emotional type, or claim that they just don't think about things that much. But what they're really doing is keeping a safe distance, because for them, emotional closeness feels like a loss of control. This emotional unavailability keeps the relationship in a constant state of ambiguity. You never really know how they feel about you. You never get the kind of emotional feedback that helps you feel secure. You might hear vague sentiments like, I care about you, or I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to be, but you rarely get real expressions of love, vulnerability, or future plans. And if you ask for more, they'll often imply that your needs are excessive or that you're putting pressure on them. This is where the gaslighting effect sneaks in again. Because while they claim to be emotionally healthy and independent, they suddenly make you feel like your desire for emotional closeness is a problem. You start to question whether your expectations are fair. You tell yourself to be more understanding, more patient, more low maintenance. But in doing so, you shrink. You silence your needs. You adapt to a dynamic that feels increasingly one-sided and increasingly lonely. What's important to recognize is that emotional unavailability isn't neutral. It's not a harmless personality trait. It shapes the entire emotional structure of the relationship. You end up carrying the emotional weight for both people. You're the one doing the emotional checking in, managing conflict, keeping the connection alive, and trying to interpret the silence. You're the one stretching yourself thin to fit into their narrow definition of closeness. Over time, this can be incredibly damaging to your emotional health. You become disconnected from your own needs. You become overly focused on their moods, their behaviors, their approval. And you start to confuse their occasional warmth or presence for emotional intimacy, even though it's often just a brief pause in a much larger pattern of distance. The truth is, emotional unavailability, cloaked in independence, is a power move, even if it's unconscious. It keeps the dismissive avoidant in control of the relationship's depth. They get to decide when, if ever, vulnerability happens. They control the emotional pace, while you're left wondering if you're too much or if you're just asking for the bare minimum. This isn't about demonizing them. Dismissive avoidance learned early in life that emotions weren't safe or welcome. Their detachment is a coping mechanism, not a character flaw. But that doesn't mean you have to keep accepting emotional scraps while calling it love. Emotional availability is not optional in a healthy relationship. It's the foundation of trust, intimacy, and safety. And if someone consistently withholds it while labeling themselves as independent, what they're really doing is denying you access to the core of the relationship. You deserve more than a partner who shows up physically but disappears emotionally. You deserve a relationship where independence doesn't come at the cost of intimacy, where strength includes softness, and where being emotionally available isn't a rare event, it's a daily practice. Emotional distance should never be mistaken for emotional maturity. One is a wall, the other is a door. And you have every right to choose connection over silence, closeness over control, and truth over confusion. At the heart of every power game, dismissive avoidance, play lies, fear of vulnerability, fear of intimacy, fear of losing control. But the people who love them often pay the price. You end up walking on emotional eggshells, silencing your needs, and shrinking your truth just to keep the connection alive. And the irony is, the very closeness they're avoiding is the same closeness you're craving, not because you're needy, but because you're human. These patterns, emotional distancing, minimizing needs, gaslighting through withdrawal, hiding behind false independence, aren't just frustrating. They're emotionally draining. They chip away at your sense of self and redefine what you believe you're allowed to ask for in love. But let's be clear, wanting connection isn't weakness. Needing emotional availability isn't too much. And being someone who feels deeply isn't a flaw, it's a strength. You don't need to fix them. You don't need to earn their warmth or work harder to prove your worth. You deserve a relationship that's emotionally mutual, grounded in honesty, and open to real closeness, not one where you're constantly proving you're easy enough to love. It's not your job to heal someone who refuses to meet you halfway. Your job is to protect your peace, honor your truth, and remember this. Love without emotional safety is not love, it's survival. And you were made for more than surviving. You were made for connection, truth, and a love that shows up fully, freely, and without fear.